A 28-year-old woman mysteriously vanished from her own home, leaving her bedroom light on. They had been looking for her for months, and the story started to sound like a detective show. The police had barely looked into the case, so the missing woman's parents turned to an independent team of former detectives. It was only thanks to them that the horrible truth came out. Kate Waring was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. She had 2 boys and loving parents who tried to give them the best of all. Kate loved animals from a young age and started volunteering at animal shelters when she was in her teens. She also danced, had many friends, and was a very positive person. It seemed like the woman grew up in a good place, and in some ways she did. However, just before she went to college, she told her parents that someone close to her family had abused her as a child. To be found. This was a big surprise for Kate's parents, who had no idea what their daughter had been going through for years. After the woman told them this terrible secret, her parents did everything they could to help her, but the effects of such a trauma only got worse over time. First, Kate had problems with alcohol, and then with drugs. At one point, her parents suggested she get help, and she agreed, home and live with her family, which was also supposed to help her deal with her problems. At the time, Kate was an adult and living on her own, but she agreed to come home anyway. At first, therapy seemed to be helping, but Kate still could not let go of the past and start living life to the fullest. The psychiatrist she went to diagnosed her with depression, but at one point, everything changed. Her father, who constantly yelled at her, died, offered to take Kate on a trip anywhere in the world she wanted. The woman was excited by the idea and soon decided she wanted to go beyond the Arctic Circle. Her dream was to see polar bears. Even though she had been hurt by animals, they started looking for tours and soon bought tickets. They were going to get to the Arctic Circle by ship, and Kate could not wait for this exciting journey. At this point, Kate's parents watched as her depression got worse. When they finally went on the trip, Kate was thrilled. She and her father had a great time, and the woman gained a lot of good feelings on the ship that took them to the Arctic Circle. During the trip, Kate met another tourist from Russia. They talked and wrote to each other. By the end of the trip, Kate liked him, and after he went home, she decided to go to Russia. There, she met him again, and she even thought about staying in the country. Kate's visa was up for renewal, so she had to go back home. Despite this, it seemed like the woman had finally gotten over her depression. She planned to fix visa problems back home and even started writing a book for her kids. It seemed like her life was finally getting better. But on June 12, 2009, everything changed. Kate was home alone while her family was away on business. She always called her father to let him know she was okay, but she did not this time. He called Kate, but she did not answer. After a while, he asked his wife to come home and check on their daughter. Kate had had problems with alcohol and illegal drugs in the past, so her parents were still worried. When her mother got home, she did not find Kate there, but the light in her room was on. It looked like she had been out for a while and would be back soon. Her mother waited a few hours, but Kate still was not home. She also found that Kate had a home that needed to be taken regularly. Despite their worry, Kate's parents decided not to worry and wait for their daughter to show up. Kate was already 28 years old at the time, so they knew she could live her life. Kate's father decided to wait until Monday, when he would call the police. On Monday morning, the father got a call from the bank. An employee told him that a man had come into the office and tried to cash more checks. Kate Waring, they could not get in touch with the woman herself, and her father was in charge of her account. The whole thing seemed very strange. The woman's father knew that his daughter only had a few $100s in her account, which is why the bank security service called him. They said the woman's signature looked real, and they gave the name of the man who had brought the check. His name was Ethan Mack, and he did not know him. Real One assumed that this man was a friend of his daughter's, but he still went to the police because Kate was still not talking to him. The police started looking into the man's disappearance, and the first thing they asked Ethan was about his relationship with the missing man. Ethan said that he had known Gay for years and that she had given him the check to pay off her old debts. He also said that he often gave her money for clothes, jewelry, and other purchases, confirmed that she and Ethan had been friends for a long time. According to them, they had never been in a relationship, but they had always been close. Ethan said that he and Kate met on Friday night and went out to eat at a restaurant. After dinner, he drove Kate home and went about his own business. He even showed the detectives letters from Kate that backed up what he said about the dinner. Ethan let the detectives look around his house, where he lived with his wife, and the situation with the check was still strange to the police, so they were not in a hurry to let him go. Eventually, Ethan called the police station and asked them to leave him alone. The police tried to piece together what happened on that Friday night when Kate was last seen. She went to see her therapist in the afternoon, then to the gym, then to the store, where she bought a bottle of wine. Surveillance cameras caught her talking to someone, but they could not figure out who it was. During the investigation, she may have been talking to Ethan, who later picked her up and took her to a restaurant. The woman's parents also remembered that on the day she went missing, Kate told them she was in trouble, but she would not say what it was about. They did not remember this until a few days later. Unfortunately, none of this helped in any way, and as the weeks went by and the woman was still missing, her parents thought the police were not doing enough. Kate Waring's case was given a second chance, and a group of former police officers led by a lawyer named Andy Savage took it on. This group had been looking into cold cases on their own, and Kate Waring's case interested them in particular. The group was made up of 5 men, all of whom had a lot of law enforcement experience. One of them was former Detective James Randolph, who first looked in Kate's bedroom. There, he noticed 2 suspicious things. The first was a package he was worried that she would never skip a drug on her own, and the fact that she had left the package at home was a red flag. Next, he found Chinese money on Kate's bed. This was strange, because Kate's parents had no idea where the woman got the money or why she needed it. Then, a team member named Bobby Minner got involved. He was an expert at finding information about people on the internet and finding them. His skills came in handy. Kate called her friend James around 10 p.m., but he did not answer. She left him a very disturbing voicemail in which she said that someone had stolen her credit cards. He went on to find out that her phone was last used at 1:53 a.m. when she called her own voicemail box number. For some reason, Bobby found out that the haul was made from the James Island area, which was just a few miles from Kate's house. He talked to a few people he knew who lived in James Island and found out something strange. Ethan Mack, who had agreed to let the police check out his and his mother's house, did not actually live there. Instead, he rented an apartment in a nearby building. Eugene was very lucky to find out these details because one of his close friends turned out to be the owner of the apartment Ethan had rented. As the team of detectives dug deeper, they found out that Ethan Mack had the team decided to look into the case on their own. They found out that Ethan had a girlfriend named Heather Camp. When they asked Kate's parents if they knew the woman, Kate's mother told them a strange story about how she met Heather a month before she went missing. She and Kate were on the same train from Washington, D.C., where the woman was having trouble getting her visa to Russia. After meeting Ethan, the woman was going to Russia. Kate agreed to help and loaned her a certain amount of money. A few days later, Heather told Kate that her daughter had died in a car accident in New Jersey, which made no sense. Heather did not go to New Jersey, and her behavior suggested that her daughter's death did not bother her. Another strange fact was that an Indiana fraud case had been filed against Heller. This was because she was pretending to be a licensed doctor and forging the necessary documents. The team gathered a lot of information that made them look at the case from a different angle. They gave all of this information to the police, but they did not want to look into the case any further. The team realized that the only way to get the police to look into the case was to give them false information. In order to find out what happened to Ethan, the team took extreme measures. First, Eugene Frazier asked a friend who rented Ethan's apartment to put a hidden camera in front of the door. They also put a hidden GPS tracker on Ethan's car. This let the team track his movements and see what he was up to. It was not long before it paid off. After looking at Ethan's itinerary, the former detectives figured out that he had been to followed his steps and found out that at each of these pawn shops, the man sold different pieces of jewelry in small batches. Unfortunately, they could not find out if the jewelry belonged to Kate, but the detectives felt like they were getting close to a clue. After a while, they ran into a big problem. The owner of the apartment where Ethan and Heather were staying told them that he was going to kick them out for not paying rent. The team knew that if they moved out, they would lose, so they tried hard to persuade the owner not to do it. At the same time, the detectives quickly came up with a new plan. They asked the owner to give Ethan and Heather more time to pay their rent, but they had to sign a contract promising to pay it back. This trick worked, and as soon as the landlord gave the team this contract, they sent it to the lab. Their goal was to compare Ethan and he to see if they were the same person. Signature on the very check for $4,000. And here they have their long-awaited break. The specialist said with absolute certainty that the signature on the check was written by the same person who had signed Heather on the contract. This meant that it was Heather who had forged Kate's signature. But the team knew that the lazy police would not listen to them, so they came up with a new plan. Ethan that the apartment needed to be treated for bugs. The head of the team put on an exterminator suit and went to the apartment with the owner ahead of time. The detectives waited until Ethan left the apartment and noticed that his car had pulled away from the house. When James and the owner went inside, they got an unpleasant surprise. Ethan was at home. It turned out that Heather was driving his car, but it was too late to call off the whole operation, so James had to change his plans. James listened to the story about the need to get rid of the bugs and asked Ethan to wait outside the apartment while dangerous chemicals were sprayed. Ethan, who did not suspect anything, agreed and went outside. At the same time, James started to carefully search the apartment for any evidence that might link Ethan to Kate's disappearance. James looked in Ethan's backpack and looked at what was inside. Chinese money was the first clue, since the same bills were on Kate's bed. James could not find any more clues, so he and the landlord pretended to do the processing and left. The team had to come up with a new plan. When they looked at the camera footage in front of Ethan's apartment, they noticed that one man came in a lot. It turned out that this man was a neighbor of the couple named Terry Williams. The detective thought that Williams might know something about Ethan and Heather's role in Kate's disappearance, so they took a risk and decided to tell the police what Williams' friends had done to Kate. They took the bag of cash and went to Williams' apartment with this offer. However, the detectives were in for a surprise. When they knocked on Williams' door and told him about their offer, Heather was there and heard everything. It turned out that Heather was cheating on Ethan with Williams. When Heather heard the detectives talking to Williams, she got scared. She called Ethan and screamed. Williams. Over the next few days, they tried to figure out what to do next. But then another surprise happened. William called them and invited them to his house for a talk. When the detectives got there, he told them that Ethan and Heather had not told him anything directly, but he thought they had done something bad to Kate. He then took an iPod off the shelf and said that Heather had given it to him just days after Kate went missing. iPod, and thanks to the serial number, they were able to figure out that it did belong to Kate. This set of clues was enough to send the team back to the Charleston Police Department, and this time the local cops could not shrug off the job. After looking at everything the team had found, they finally arrested Ethan and Heather. At the first interview, Heather agreed to help with the investigation as long as the police helper got minimal punishment. Guatemala Island, about 20 miles from her home. The police sent out a search party and combed the area all day, but Kate's body was not there. It soon became clear that Heather had just lied to them. Andy Savage then came up with another plan. He knew that Heather was probably involved in Kate's murder, but he met with her and said he would help. Heather is sure that this is her only chance, and Kate agrees. She said that Kate's body is still on the outskirts of Guatemala Island, near Polly Point Road. She also gave a specific location. The detectives went there without the police, and they were disappointed when they did not find Kate. But the next day, they went back, and they did. The woman's remains were found, but medical examiners could not figure out what killed her. In August 2009, Heather signed a confession to murder, obstructing justice, and check fraud. The police found that the woman had been a con artist for years, and on that train from Washington, D.C., she chose Kate as her next victim. She later started dating Ethan, but he was not in a hurry to plead guilty, and his trial started in October 2010. On the day she went missing, Kate found out that Heather had cheated on her and stolen her credit cards. She threatened to tell her father, who would probably call the police. Heather told Ethan, who sided with her even though she had been friends with Kate for a long time. According to the investigation, Kate had dinner that night with Ethan and Heather. Heather was also there. Heather may have promised Kate that she would return the credit cards and money that were in Ethan's apartment. When all three of them got to the restaurant, Heather could not take it anymore and attacked Kate. The court did not believe Heather's story and gave her 39 years in prison. Ethan, on the other hand, got 25 years. The difference is because Heather was also charged with fraud. It could be the basis for detective movies. On the one hand, we have Kate, who was hurt badly as a child and turned to alcohol and other drugs. She found the strength to change her life for the better and beat her depression. On the other hand, we have the sad fact that her life was cut short by a mix of betrayal and greed. Ethan Mack was her close friend for years, but he killed her for the sake of his new lover. When they found out that the woman had a history of drug problems, they put the case on hold. This is where people with useful skills and a desire for justice came to the rescue. A group of independents did more than the entire police department, and it was only because of them that the killers were sent to jail and Kate's family was relieved of the heavy burden of ignorance. It is important to note that not a single police officer was involved in the case, to the truth. And what do you think about these minor infractions? Is it possible to use surveillance and fake searches to show that someone killed someone? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you like the movie, do not forget to click the likes button.
The student got off the bus and was nowhere to be found. Without a trace, her body was found in a field the next day. The police looked for the killer for 39 years, but it was not until 2019 that they were able to find out what really happened. We will tell you what happened. Helene Brzezinski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, which is near New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her older brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old, respectively. The girl grew up with love and care, got along well with her older relatives, and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14, her father got a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton near Boston. There, she went to the local school and developed a passion for after high school. She went to Wheaton College, which was 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough for her to visit her family often, and it also had a great writing program. Helen got used to being a college student quickly. She did well in school and was involved in college life. Eventually, she got a chance she was excited about. She was going to do an internship at a radio news station in Denver, even though the city was more than 3,000 miles away from our college. Helene was excited about the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to take her in for the internship. She also went with a classmate who studied journalism in January 1980. Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at a radio station. Every day she had to take the bus from the office to her home. The trip took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station as usual at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. The only thing was that she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry because Helen had always warned her before. If she planned to be somewhere late, the woman waited a few hours. But at 11:30 she decided to go to the police. After all, investigators had already begun a search, immediately fearing that her disappearance might be connected to a recent string of attacks on women in the area. They combed the area along Helen's route all night, but could not find her in the morning. A woman approached the police. She was driving her car through a suburban area of Denver with her children. At one point they noticed someone lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped. The car walked closer and saw the body of a young girl with no signs of life. The police arrived on the scene and immediately identified Helen. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands were tied behind her back, and all her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girl had been stabbed 9 times and abused. The death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m. A person who saw Helene get off the bus at 5:30 was able to be found by the cops. She had several kilometers to walk from the bus stop, and it appears that the perpetrator attacked her at that point. Law enforcement agencies surveyed the area near where the body was found, but they were unable to find almost any clues other than shoe impressions, presumably size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By then, medical examiners had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing that appeared belonged to the killer, except that in those years it could not help the investigation, because the science of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development. But the samples were sent to a laboratory for storage, hoping that they would help identify the perpetrator in the future. Police turned to the public for information using newspapers and local television. They tried to find witnesses who might have seen Helen that night. Soon they were approached by a woman who, at about 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman could not get a good look at the man she provided the police with, only generalities that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step with the consent of the witness. They invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details, on the basis of which it turned out to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is hard to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time the police had nothing but this drawing, but they could not find a single suspect, and the case froze for years. Helen's college diploma was given to her after she died as a way to remember her. The school also named an alumni award after her because she was always involved in college life. The investigation was not reopened until 1998. 18 years after the murder by then, technology in the field of DNA research had progressed markedly, and researchers had entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal convictions, at least not since they began taking DNA samples from convicts. 15 more years passed, and in 2013 the local police department created a unit to handle unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but no new leads could be found. A DNA sample from the victim's body never showed up in the FBI database. This meant the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police for other possible crimes all this time. Throughout all these years, Helen's relatives and police were not the only ones trying to find the truth. The girl's high school friends with whom she was in the choir took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to get the story out to the public and distributed flyers about Helen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again, and this time the detectives had much more to go on by this point. Forensics had begun to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the perpetrator's identity could be deduced through his relatives. Of course, this was a very complicated and time-consuming process. Moreover, this method worked only in the case if the relatives of the DNA possessor were in the publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mostly used to search for family members. In 2018, police turned over available DNA samples to the Parabon lab, which had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts looked at about 3,000 matches, including even distant relatives of the alleged killer. They had to get rid of people who did not fit the age range or could not have committed the crime for other reasons. In the end, they decided that the person with the DNA was probably the son of a woman named June Estes, who was dead at the time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was only able to identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old. A year went by before something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie put her DNA sample into a public database, which was the best way to find criminals. Experts at Parabon saw that Jessie was a close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. After a more detailed DNA test, they found that Jessie's 3rd cousin was the killer. Detectives asked the woman for information about her family to finally find the suspect. Immediately after uploading her data into the database, the woman began collecting information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to enter their DNA into the database. Through this, experts at Parabon determined that the killer was related to Jessie on her father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer will drag on for several more months. Expert detectives and Jessie's family worked together to get closer to the owner of the DNA from the murder scene, and soon it finally happened. The cops were able to reach a relative of June Estes, and he gave new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, her father took the boys and took them to another town. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives were to find out which one of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The Cavs immediately discovered that William had been incarcerated multiple times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helen's body has been run through that database repeatedly since then, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial match, even when brothers are involved. 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect named Curtis White, who also went by the last name Clanton. It turned out that this man had a long criminal history. When he was 18, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he grabbed a knife and abused the victim before running away. He was quickly caught and sentenced to 30 years in prison, but he was released after only 4 years because he was defended. Curtis moved in and got a job as a gardener in the area where Helen was killed. He later moved to Florida, which is where the officers went to look for him in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old at the time and worked as a trucker. Before charging him with Helen's murder, investigators wanted more hard evidence. After a week's surveillance, they got a hidden DNA sample from him, but it wasn't enough. Followed to a club, he confessed to a brutal murder. Life sentence granted at 82. Victim's family found closure after almost 40 years. Other cases possibly linked but unproven. Justice served partially. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like the video if you like it. Thanks for watching. When a young woman went to the parking lot of her school to go to a sporting event, she disappeared without a trace. Soon, a very creepy discovery was made, and the police got involved. It took detectives 28 years to solve this creepy mystery, and none of them knew it would be the first of its kind. Sarah Yarborough was born in Portland, Oregon, on June 12, 1975. Her parents soon moved to a different state and settled in the town of Federal Way, which is close to Seattle and is basically a suburb of it. Had 2 brothers and helped her parents take care of the youngest one. She was close to him from a young age. Sarah was involved in music and ballet. She worked hard in school so she could get into a good college. Because of her good grades, she went to New Zealand twice as part of a school program. Later, Sarah joined her school's cheerleading team. She also had a lot of friends. Sarah was 16 when she went to an event with her cheerleading team. They met at the school building where the bus would pick them up. But Sarah got the time wrong. She thought the bus would pick them up at 8 a.m., but it was not supposed to come until 9 a.m. Sarah's friends started to arrive, but no one saw her. Some students saw her car in the parking lot, but there was no young woman. Students thought this was strange, but no one could reach Sarah because none of them had cell phones at the time. Around the same time, 2 12-year-old boys were walking around the school grounds. They saw a strange man come out from behind some bushes, look at them, and walk away in the opposite direction. The boys thought he was strange, but they did not pay much attention and kept walking. The children thought she was dead when they saw her lying on the ground with no signs of life. They ran home to tell their parents, and the parents of one of the boys went with him to the scene. The father of the other boy decided to follow the suspicious man the children had seen. His son told him that he saw a car that looked like a Chevrolet Nova pull away from that spot. Since he lived near the school, he went outside to try to find that car. At one point, he was able to. The man lost sight of it, and he could not find it again. In the meantime, the other boy's parents came to the school and realized that the young woman on the ground was probably dead. They ran to the school building and called the police. When the police arrived, they confirmed that the young woman was indeed dead. From the marks on her neck, they were also able to quickly figure out that the dead woman was Sarah. They concluded that the victim had probably been strangled. Officers found Sarah's shoes, pants, and socks, but nothing else. They found her purse and car keys inside the car in the school parking lot, which led them to think that she may have been attacked right next to the car and then dragged behind the trees. The body was taken to a medical examiner, and the police started looking for clues. Bushes near her body. They said he was a tall man in his early 20s with shoulder-length blonde hair, a dark raincoat, and black trousers. Soon, the police found another witness with a very surprising story. A man out for a jog saw a strange scene in the same wooded area. A young woman was lying next to some bushes, and a man was hovering over her. The young woman was not moving at all, so the witness thought that in both cases, the man and the young woman were still on the side of the road. It did not seem to him that a crime was being committed. The witness told the police that he had just moved to the U.S. from another country and did not know what was normal behavior there. However, he still gave the police a rough description of the killer that matched what the children said about him, who had been near the school, but no other useful leads were found. In the meantime, medical experts looked at Sarah's body and decided that this triangulation was the cause of her death. Apparently, the person who killed her used her own tights. In addition, a serious injury was found on the young woman's head. The experts thought that from this below, the victim lost consciousness, which was consistent with the runner's story. He saw that the young woman on the ground did not move at all. In almost every piece of Sarah's clothing, they found traces of male semen from the same person. However, in 1991, there was no common DNA database, so all the detectives could do was compare DNA samples from specific suspects. The medical examiner also told the detectives that Sarah's body showed no signs of sexual abuse, even though forensic scientists had found traces of male semen on her clothes. Sarah got to school almost an hour early, and she was the only one in the parking lot. Her killer probably saw her there and waited for her to get out of the car, then hit her on the head with something until she lost consciousness. He then dragged her from the parking lot and put her behind some trees, where her body was later found. The killer took off some of Sarah's clothes and did sexual acts on her before strangling her with her own belt. Police were able to find Sarah's body because it was in a Chevrolet Nova. However, they were disappointed to find out that the driver of that car had just been delivering donuts that morning. His DNA did not match that found on Sarah's clothes. It seems that the kids just saw the car driving down the road next to them and thought the killer was in it. Over the next few days, police continued to look for witnesses and new leads, but they did not make much progress. On Monday, school started again, even though all the students were horrified by what had happened. The murder had happened only a few meters from their school, and the killer's identity was still unknown. The young women were afraid. Teams arranged to walk each student to her car or bus so they would not be left alone on the street. Detectives found that there were about 70 potential witnesses in and around the school that morning, and they talked to each of them. However, they did not learn anything new. Based on what the two children and the jogger said, a rough sketch of the killer was made and sent to all local newspapers and TV stations. The story got a lot of media attention. Hundreds of tips came in, and investigators looked into each one, but none of them led anywhere. At one point, they got a tip about a man who fit the killer's description and had a criminal history, but his DNA did not match the killer's sample. Since then, the case has been on hold for many months. In total, the police got about 4,000 different leads, and they tried to follow each one, but they did not have enough resources. As investigators continued to look for the killer and new cases came up every month, time was also working against them. When Sarah's family found out that the police did not have enough resources to handle all the tips, her grandfather did what he could to help. He worked for a technology company and persuaded management to give the police department a very powerful computer with 150,000 memory chips. Still went along with it. With this computer, police officers could store information about all the leads in one place, process them faster, and sort them in a way that made them easy to study. Despite this, every lead led them down a dead end, and in the years that followed, they made no progress. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated, and before graduation, they decided to honor their friend. They raised a lot of money and used it to build a memorial to Sarah. In metal next to these things was a picture of the young woman's dog reaching for her purse. Over the years that followed, the case was reopened and all the evidence was looked at again, but the police were still unable to find out who did it. During this time, the police talked to thousands of people and took DNA samples from nearly 300 possible suspects, but none of this helped. In 2011, 20 years after the woman went missing, the case was still unsolved. He heard about a company that was working in the field of genetic genealogy. The policeman contacted the company and asked if they could try to find relatives of the person whose DNA was found on the victim's body. Unfortunately, they failed. In 2011, genetic genealogy was just starting to become popular, so the experts did not know how to search for both male and female relatives. DNA of a man, they could only look for family ties with other men, and vice versa. They also had to deal with laws that said they could not use genetic data samples to look for relatives of suspects. However, it did lead to some interesting results. For example, the team of researchers the detective approached had already been working for years to make a genetic pedigree of the first people who came to the United States. After looking at the killer Sarah's DNA, they found that he was related to one of the ship's passengers, Robert Fuller. However, it was almost impossible to track him down this way, since there were just over 100 people on the ship at the time. But over the centuries, they have had more than 25 million descendants. Also, The detectives did not know that he had made the Sarah Yarborough case the first of its kind, even though his idea was not new. The detective tried to use the information he had and tracked down several men with the Fuller surname who lived in his town at the time of Sarah's murder. He found photos of them and met the only witness, a jogger, and 2 men who had found the body as children. Unfortunately, neither of them recognized the killer in the photo. Finally, the investigators asked for DNA samples from every Fuller in the area and sent them to a lab. Experts found that one of the men was a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from that same ship. However, he was not the killer, and he did not even know that any distant relatives lived near him. The killer may have been so distantly related to him that his family never knew of the connection. The detective retired in 2017, and the case was given to a new team of investigators, TEST, in 2011. By that time, scientists knew a lot more about how to study genetic material, so they agreed to try to trace the killer's family tree. It took them 2 years. First, they used public databases to find even the most distant relatives of the killer. Then, they tried to manually trace their family ties to find people who lived in Federal Way at the time of Sarah's death. In total, they had to get rid of several thousand people before they found the right one. Sarah's clothes most likely belonged to one of her 2 brothers, who were 33 and 27 years old at the time of the murder. The older brother, Patrick Nicholas, turned out to be a violent criminal with a long criminal record. His DNA sample was in the FBI database, so he could not have killed Sarah because his DNA would have shown a match back in the 1990s. The younger brother, Patrick Nicholas, has also been on the police's radar for violent crimes, including crimes against children, but that was before the DNA samples of such criminals were added to the database. Detectives immediately set up a surveillance of the man. The man, who was 55 at the time, lived in a nearby town called Wellington. The police had been watching his every move for 2 days, and soon the chance came up. Patrick went to the laundry, and while he was waiting for his clothes to be washed, he went outside to smoke. The police put it in a bag marked evidence and went back to Patrick's car. The next time Patrick went outside to smoke, a handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The men did not pick it up and went back to the laundry room. The police were happy to take the second piece of evidence in case the experts could not get a DNA sample from the cigarette bite. However, the experts were able to get samples from all of these items easily, and the very next day they arrested the sperm that was found on Sarah's clothes in 1991 was a perfect match for Patrick's DNA. The judge immediately issued a warrant for the man's arrest, and the police took him into custody. It took 5 days from when investigators first learned his name to when he was officially charged with murder. When his biography was leaked to the media, many people began to ask why a man with such a criminal history was not even considered a suspect for all those 28 years. At age 19, Patrick Nicholas went up to a police officer and said, "I am the guy who killed my mother." Young woman, and got into her car, where he tried to abuse her. The victim was able to get away, but she had to jump into the river and swim for a long time to get far enough away. Patrick spent 4 years in prison, and then he was let out. The next time the police caught him, he was trying to abuse an underage young woman. He was arrested again, but his DNA was not in any database. Patrick's biological grandfather was adopted and grew up under the adopt-a-family name. One of the men who found Sarah's body as children in 1991 said Patrick was without a doubt the killer, and he admitted it. He was only 12 years old when the body was found, but the killer had known him for years. The witness was always afraid that the killer would come after him, and it was not until Patrick's arrest that he finally felt safe. Patrick's trial did not start until 2023. The man insisted he was innocent, and his lawyer tried to challenge the main evidence, DNA, which showed that Patrick's semen was on the victim's body. Lawyer also tried to question the accuracy of the DNA analysis, but experts said that those claims were completely false. Patrick was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder without premeditation. On May 25th, he was given a sentence of 45 years and 8 months in prison, which makes it very unlikely that he will ever get out. During the reading of that sentence, Patrick did not show any emotion, unlike Sarah's family, who spoke to the judge about how they were thinking about Sarah. Investigators for bringing the killer to justice, even though he had avoided justice for 28 years. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, And don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Thanks for watching.